Duke University is privileged to invite Professor Peter Perdue to join us at Global Asia Conversation with the Scholars. I am Yuan Chen, Environmental Humanities Fellow of the Global Asia Initiative and Franklin Humanities Institute. Peter Perdue is Professor Emeritus of History at Yale University. He is the author of the Levinson Prize-winning book, China Marches West, The Qing Conquest of Central Eurasia. His recent book, Environmental History, Its Origins and Prospects, was published in Chinese as Wan Wu Bing Zuo. He has also co-authored and co-edited a number of important global history books, including the 3-volume series Asia Inside Out. Professor Perdue, I know you're always introduced as a China historian, but I find introducing you as a China historian does not fully encompass the broad scope of your research, both geographically and conceptually. Your book, China Marches West, for example, is an excellent example of transnational history. It brings to light this intriguing story of China's Qing dynasty, which was founded by the Manchus, and its conquest of the Dzungar people in Xinjiang. Before we dive further into this fascinating story, do you mind first telling the audience who were the Manchu and the Dzungar, and also what was the place of Xinjiang, which literally means the new territory in the Qing dynasty?
All right, yes, a quick summary of a very long book. Well, the Manchus were the rulers of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China. They declared the Qing dynasty in 1636, and the Qing dynasty fell in 1911. The first century and a half of the Qing was a time of expansion, as the Manchus came from Manchuria, the northeast, and then went south and took Beijing, and then went farther south, and then went and took Taiwan in the 17th century, but then they moved to the northwest, and they wanted to expand into Central Asia, which is the modern territories of Mongolia and Xinjiang in particular. Because the Mongols had historically been the major rivals for power in Central Asia, the Manchus were very acquainted with the Mongols, being in Manchuria next to Mongolia. And so ever since the Kangxi Emperor of the 1670s, they had determined that they would march west or northwest, really, to destroy this rival Mongol power. And so the story of my book is how the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, they had assistance, they were allied with Mongols and with Han Chinese, conquered this entire region that we now know as Mongolia and Xinjiang. And they completed that conquest in really 1757, to be exact, which really ended the rival Mongolian state, which was led by a group called the Dzungars, and led to the Qing takeover of this whole vast region now.
Right, and the Dzungar people, I think they no longer exist today, right?
There may be a small group in independent Mongolia that still has that name, but in effect, the Qing ethnically cleansed them, let's say. They eliminated them as a people as part of the conquest.
So thank you for this introduction of these key players, the Manchu and the Dzungar, as well as the introduction of the Mongols and their alliance. So when we talk about 18th century and the colonial history, our common perspective is often Eurocentric, meaning that we mostly focus on the expansion of the European empires overseas. But China Marches West tells us that in the same period, in the 18th century, there was this intriguing story of the conquest by an East Asian empire, which had a Northeast Asian origin, as you just described, and the conquest what happened in Central Asia. So what can we learn about the similarities and the differences between imperial expansions by Eastern and Western powers?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, so this, on the part of the Qing, this was a military conquest. It expanded the empire of the Qing to make it larger than any other dynasty had ever really been, except for the short-lived Yuan dynasty. And the Qing achieved this for three reasons, I think. First, it was military superiority. They had Manchu and Mongolian troops who knew how to fight on horses, just as well as the Mongolian troops that they were opposing. Second, diplomacy. They had negotiated treaties with the Russians to essentially stay neutral, offering Russian trade advantages, so the Russians wouldn't back the rival Mongolian state. They also had treaties and submission by many Mongolian chieftains. And then logistics, they were able to provide their military with enough grain and clothes and weapons and horses so that they could maintain these military expeditions for years out in these very difficult conditions of the steppe. And mercantile relations they promoted by bringing in Chinese merchants to trade with local people. At the same time, they minimized the strain on the economy of China itself, so that they could send goods out from China to Central Asia to support the military. These are all very standard features of imperial expansion everywhere. Every expanding empire will do or try to do all of these things. It has to conquer its enemies, it has to supply its troops, it has to provide trade, it has to engage in diplomacy. And in this period in particular, it was the British, the French, the Russians, for example, who were expanding their territory across the globe, Eurasia in particular, and promoting all these things: diplomacy, trade, military conquest, and settler colonialism. This is another aspect where you take your own people and you try to encourage them to settle in the conquered lands, to clear it for agriculture. And the Qing did that too, just as the British did it in the US or Australia or any other places. So in the broad sense, this is imperialism being practiced by everybody, and it's a global process in which the Qing is participating. I think it's more common among Western scholars now than, say, it was several decades ago to describe the Qing as a colonial empire, that it has these resemblances to these other empires of the time. But there's certainly many people who resist this and want to point to the differences. And we shouldn't ignore the differences, of course. But if you try to claim that the Qing is just unique or distinct or somehow very, very different from the Western empires and didn't do the things that the bad things that Western empires did, for example, well, I just don't think the historical evidence supports that. There are many, many resemblances. Now we can look at, degrees of difference. Certainly, the British colonized India through a monopoly chartered corporation, that is the East India Company of merchants, and it was done for profit, of course, in the beginning. And the Qing expansion, at least in the beginning, wasn't led by merchants. It was led by soldiers and officials for territorial and geopolitical reasons, first of all. But certainly later on, they tried to make the territory profitable, and they brought in merchants, as I said. And on the British side, very soon after the East India Company went to India, it became, in effect, the tax collector for the Mughal emperor. So it was also interested in landed territorial control. So the mixture of mercantile profit and territorial control is a little different in both cases, but arguably they actually tend to converge. The East India Company becomes a territorial landowner, and then it's of course abolished later, and then the British take full colonial control. The Qing start out with a military conquest, but bring in more and more merchants, and becomes much more mercantile driven, and so they kind of converge on these twin goals of territory and profit. Britain is an overseas empire, of course, like mostly that of the French, and the Qing is a landed empire, like that of the Russians, say, or the Habsburg Empire or the Ottomans. Well, how big a difference and how significant are these differences? This is a very large topic of debate, of course. But again, I think they aren't exactly as huge as you might think. Let's just say one argument is that the the cultural and racial gap between the British and the Indian population, because it was so far away and overseas, was extremely large. And because the Qing was a landed empire and moved out more gradually, and they had closer connections to the Mongols, there was more cultural, at least similarity, not assimilation, but more connection between the Qing, Manchus, and Mongols than there arguably were between the British and the Indians. This is true of landed empires in general. I think Russia, arguably, as it moved east, again, you have a sort of gradual slope, as Owen Lattimore described it, of contacts between Russians and Turks and Mongols and mixing, and even, not all Russian historians would accept this, Turco-Mongolian influence on the Russian state itself coming back, and the Qing likewise. The British had an explicit ideology of racial superiority, to be sure, to justify their rule. The Qing didn't claim, in that sense, racial superiority in a genetic sense, but they certainly regarded conquered peoples as barbarians. There's a long-standing Chinese discussion of uncivilized barbarian peoples on the frontier who need to be civilized. So the French word mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, is certainly shared by the Qing and other Chinese dynasties and the British and the French in a somewhat different form. Also, there's this other interesting phenomenon called in Western imperial studies translatio imperii. That's the Latin phrase for the shifting of an imperial form from one center and one culture to another. So in Western history, it's common you would trace this from, say, the Roman Empire in the West to the Byzantine Empire in the East, the Holy Roman Empire of Germany, or the Russian attempt to create a third Rome, then the British coming along, and then Napoleon, and so forth. This imperial idea sort of moves around Europe with a different center, but each one, in a way, takes up the same colonial project. And we even have people comparing the US to Rome these days, of course, as the latest successor to this imperial lineage. The Chinese don't put it this way. You know, they have this idea of a dynastic cycle with a sort of continuity, which seems to involve the same thing around and around. But if you look at, say, the classic Chinese dynasties, the way they're described in this theory of Orthodox dynasties, well, I mean, the Han, the Tang, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, the Qing, all have different territory, all
very
control, all have capitals in different places, you know, and move around. So the shifting centers of imperial location and territory, and I think each of them has a different structure. In China are also this, I think, type of translatio imperii, movement, shifting of the imperial center, even though the Chinese pretend it's not that way. That's a historical construction. So there again, a difference that is something of a difference, but not really as big a difference as people think.
Right. The history of Beijing as imperial capital, or the state capital, is actually very recent, much more recent than people think. And it started as a nomadic capital, of the Liao and then the Qing, and succeeded by the Yuan. So I guess that's a lot of what a lot of people have ignored.
And the Ming Dynasty had two capitals. That's why Beijing is the northern capital, and there was also Nanjing. But Qing had two capitals, but it was Beijing and then the other one in Manchuria to the north. So they actually two different capital systems, if you like, even though Beijing was one of them.
Right. So you talk about, the British Empire, the French Empire, and their overseas colonies. So they all had a lot of resource interests in their overseas colonies. What was the resource interest of the Qing had in Xinjiang, in Northwest?
Well, I think, as we say, the original motivation of conquest was not for resources in the Qing case. It was geopolitical competition with the Mongols. But once they achieved the conquest, they wanted to develop the resources of Xinjiang, in particular, the agrarian resources of the oasis societies of Xinjiang. So they surveyed the land, they looked for water sources, they regarded the local peoples as somehow wasteful and not using the land properly, and they thought they would bring in the proper way to extract resources. But it turns out, not surprisingly, it's the local people who know best how to raise the resources, and they relied on, say, irrigation techniques that were very common. The use of canals, underground canals, bringing snow melt to the fields, and created a much larger settled Han population on top of the local Uyghur population with some of the same agrarian techniques. And so it was a production of the local resources intended to at least make Xinjiang self-supporting, which it never really could be, but they tried to make it a self-supporting region.
This book is built on the foundation of multilingual sources. You have drawn a vast amount of documents in Chinese, in Manchu, and in Russian. So can you give us some examples of how the same event was narrated differently in different languages?
Well, yes, it is, I think, important with these kinds of cross-border, transnational, whatever histories to try to get the story from several different sides. Exactly. So we have such a huge predominance of the classical Chinese literary and historical and documentary tradition that there's a danger of just being sucked into that perspective, the perspective of the Han scholars and the writers, and accept their view of the world uncritically. But looking at sources in other languages that were produced for different purposes by different people gives you another way of complementing that overwhelmingly Chinese point of view. Right. So the Manchu documents in particular, that's of course a thriving school these days, sometimes called the New Qing history, that argues that it is useful at the least to know Manchu in order to understand the activities of the Qing dynasty, and particularly in these kinds of military and frontier and Central Asian relations. The Manchu documents give you a different way of looking at things. Manchu, I believe, is a more, simpler and maybe more honest language than Chinese. Chinese bureaucrats are very good at disguising things in elaborate phraseology, when the Manchus may be just rather straightforward. I mean, exactly. If in China, you don't, you don't conquer and suppress people. You ding, you fix, you unify. Yeah. The Manchu just says we conquered them, or people shun in Chinese. They as it were voluntarily come to submit to you, right? The Manchu just says they came. I mean, we beat them and they came. They surrendered. So you have all these, of course, cities in Western China that have these terms like An, Xi'an, Western peace, and Ding of fixation. And all these are cities established by military conquest. They don't say that, but that's what it's all about. Exactly. Even in fact, the term Tiananmen, I can't remember exactly.
Heavenly peace.
We translate it as the gate of heavenly peace, but in Manchu it reads quite differently. It was heavenly pacification. That is an active verb. This is a place we have conquered. It hasn't always been peaceful. So, in general, as a rule of thumb, if you see the word "an," peace, in a Chinese name or place, it was not, that usually indicates it was not a peaceful place. It was a place of military conquest. And then I read there's even when the Manchu appears to be a translation of the Chinese, you can also find different nuances in it. The story of the death of Galdan, the Mongolian Khan, comes out differently in the Chinese text from the original Manchu text. The sort of story the Chinese historians settled on was that Galdan, once he had lost to the Kangxi Emperor in 1697, was in such despair that he committed suicide. He was a Buddhist monk, by the way, so this isn't particularly plausible, but that's the Chinese story. But the Manchu and even the earlier sources indicate there was definitely at least factionalism and disagreement about whether or not they should surrender, and he might well have been poisoned. So you got a different version of the story in another source. The Russian sources are very good for the personal interviews with the Mongolian Khans and the Russians' views of Mongolian peoples as they encountered them across Siberia and Mongolia. And they didn't use the same kind of condescending Chinese terminology. I mean, they may have considered them primitive, in a Western sense, but these were people they could talk to, they could deal with, they could trade with, they could negotiate with. So you got a different view from the Russian side.
Yeah. So since you talk about the Russian side, so I wonder if we can talk a little bit more on Russia, which has been, dominating the news headlines and social media ever since February 24th. And, many historians have gone on TV to revisit Russia's imperial and the Soviet past. But understandably, everybody seems to be focusing on the European front of Russia. It's justifiable, given that the war is happening in Ukraine, in the European soil, and also 2/3 of the Russian population concentrated and actually still concentrates in the country's eastern section and around large cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. But geographically speaking, more than 2/3 of its territory is in Asia. So it seems lopsided to, play lightly on Russia's presence to the other side of the Ural Mountain. Obviously, more than anybody else that, Russia also loomed large in the story of China marches west. So I wonder if you can briefly introduce the role of Russia in this period.
All right. Yeah. Well, let's see. The role of Russia turned out to be more important than I expected when I had first started this project. And I had studied Russian in college because I loved Russian literature. So I could read Russian archival sources and other sources. And it turned out that, of course, Russia had very early presence in Central Asia, in Siberia, Mongolia, because of its interest in the fur trade. And that's why it expanded all the way across the Urals from beginning in the 16th century into the 17th century. The fur trade was a main part of Russian state revenue at that time. There were Russian travelers and diplomats in the earlier period who learned Turkic languages and Mongolian. And we might forget the first Western school of sinology was founded in Beijing by Russian Orthodox monks. The Russian treaties with China were the first, as it were, equal treaties that China signed with a Western power. And by and large, those two treaties of 1689 and 1727 were by both sides for some time. And as I said, negotiating those treaties kept the Russians neutral in the China-Mongol War, so in effect made the conquest possible. But I wouldn't make too much of this eternal friendship argument of Russia and China. In the 19th century, Russo-Chinese relations became very hostile. Russia invaded Xinjiang, and China had to force them out militarily. And even China's relations with the Soviet Union were complex and contentious all the time. And what's curious, but then the thing that endures is they will always be neighbors. They can't get away from that. And China used to be the poor neighbor, the poor cousin in the early PRC period, and Russia was the rich one. Things have inverted now. China is the rich one, and Russia is the poor one. But as to their geopolitical behavior, I think I'm impressed by the argument of the Russian historian Stephen Kotkin on the sort of recent Russian history and behavior that Russia has always wanted to claim the right to be a great power. And there has been for some also a Eurasian school of Russian history that claims that Russia is not like the West. It has very special features because it has this Asian better features than Western imperialists. So Russia has seen itself as this very special power in the world, a great power, but as Cochrane said, it's basically a poor country. It is located where agriculture is just not very profitable. And it has smaller number of resources spread out over a vast space, which means it has to have an extremely centralized government that is primarily militarily extractive and oppressive in order to grab all those thinly spread resources and concentrate them at the center of the Russian state. And it's these efforts by the Russian state to really do what it doesn't have the resources to do through other means like diplomacy or culture or economy that explains Russia's aggressive behavior. I think that's roughly Kotkin's argument, as I see. So he rejects the idea that that the West somehow provoked Russia's invasion by refusing to accept its security interests. He thinks it was going to happen anyway. Now, China wants to be a great power too, you see. And China used to be poor, too poor to do this. But China is wealthy now. And China has always had a much more highly developed market economy than Russia, done by Chinese and not by foreigners. So China has a large economic base to build on. And that economic base was what made the Qing Conquest possible. And it's the base that makes China's expansion possible now. So China is, I think, shares some of Russia's ambitions, but has a far larger economic base to do it than Russia.
I'm also a fan of Steve Kotkin's work. It's very illuminating and very convincing. I agree with a lot of things he says.
You know, if you want to try to connect some historical aspects to current events, he's one of the best at that, I think.
Let's move on to talk about environmental history. In your book, environmental history, its origins and prospects. Chinese name is Wan Wu Bing Zuo. You spoke of how early Western scholars observed the role of environment in human history, such as the plague in Athens. In Chinese tradition, early philosophers such as Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi and Mencius, they were also keenly aware of changes in the environment or humans' harmony and disharmony with nature. So what do you see are the fundamentally difference in the perceptions of nature and the man-nature relationship in Western and Eastern traditions?
Well, yes, I have to begin by saying I really don't like to polarize two traditions against each other. This kind of question constantly comes up. I was invited to a conference, in fact, to address just that question, and was somewhat extreme, perhaps, and say, well, actually, there aren't any fundamental differences between two civilizations. Well, I would still say that. Civilization is a very, very vague and diverse concept in the first place. And the idea of fundamentally opposing the East to the West is a heritage of our imperialist, Eurocentric 19th century. So again, it doesn't mean there are no differences, but I think these ideas of two fundamental ways of looking at nature just doesn't really hold up. Within China, you can find every, I think, position on the spectrum of, say, how humans should treat the natural world and its other species. There is a Taoist idea of harmony and somewhat effort to balance different natural forces with each other. On the other side, you have, for example, the Qin dynasty that's been described in Brian Lander's book. The Qin made its power by ruthlessly eliminating diversity in its own state by just extracting grain, making grain the key link of the Chinese dynastic state. And ever since then, grain has always been the key link, as Mao said, that undergirds the Chinese dynastic regime. And so settled agriculture by Han Chinese peasants is the superior moral form of production. And everybody else, which could mean gatherer peoples or shifting agriculture in highlands or fishing or swamps, wetlands, or steppe agriculture. These are all inferior and dangerous and even wasteful ways of using the land. So China has plenty of examples of ruthless exploitation of the environment, just like the West. You know, we can't oppose the harmony of the East to the exploitation of the West. But that said, I think maybe the natural world provided a standard of judgment of dynastic rulers in the philosophical tradition and the moral advice tradition that may not be as prominent in the West. You know, of course, Mencius comparing morality, that the decline of morality is like the bare mountain that had been overgrazed, but the natural moral feelings of the people will regenerate the grasslands if you just leave them alone. And that's his argument for a light state. I can't recall that sort of argument being made by Aristotle or Plato, but and the idea of certainly omens in the sky are a universal feature of many empires and dynastic regimes, that somehow looking at the stars will inform you about the health. But maybe nobody went as far with that as the Chen Emperor did, where he organized this grand celebration when he found that at one point the sun and the moon were in the sky at the same time, and there was a conjunction of all 5 planets. And his astronomers told him this had never happened before in the course of human history, which is completely untrue. But he celebrated this as his great symbol of the great benevolence of his reign, and he had a painting commissioned to do it of a great celebration, which never happened. And so, you know, maybe overhyping this kind of auspiciousness of the heavens is a particularly Chinese thing.
Yeah, that's a 五星连珠, right? Or 七星连珠.
That's right. Yeah.
Let's talk about, environmental history as a subfield of the professionalized discipline of history. So this tradition can be traced back to the Analysis School. But research since then has certainly brought to light many new sources and also introduced new methodologies. What do you think are the most remarkable developments in the field of environmental history since the Analysis School?
Well, yeah, there's a lot one could say about it, and my book doesn't really go into that very much. And I think the rise of environmental history has been remarkably rapid across the globe now because of the environmental crises we have, of course. And I do say in my book, it has 2 origins fundamentally. The Analysis School of the French historians of the turn of the 20th century, really early 1900s, when it began, culminating perhaps in Brodel's work of the 1940s, the first edition, the 1960s. And that was focused on, first of all, regional agrarian histories. The core of the Analysis School are these vast, lovingly detailed regional histories of one part of France over a long period of time, over many centuries. So they use remarkable sources of agrarian production and population and weather to sketch out the longue durée, the long-term transformation. And most often come down to was even called by Routledge, histoire immobile, immobile history. That is, at the fundamental level of the structures of agrarian life, it's a cyclical structure that really changes very little. The other source, however, the American source, comes from American histories of the West, really, from William Cronin and Donald Worcester and others forward, is almost exactly the opposite. It's a story of radical transformation and settlement driven by modern capitalism. And it tends to focus on the 19th century forward as this period of particularly aggressive and dynamic growth. And in a way, each of these 2 schools has very specific national characteristics. I mean, the French, with their very loving, detailed histories of a small region, and the Americans with this great expansive idea that responds to our obsession with the frontier and Turner's frontier thesis. But now environmental history is global. That's the main difference now. It's done everywhere. And so every place where it is done, I think, has to absorb both of these perspectives to some extent, both the attention to region and then the sort of frontier issue. And on top of that, try to say something about global phenomena. And that is probably the newest part. And also in terms of sources, of course, the addition of all the climatic data and all the other scientific data that we have much more now than we ever had before. So that leads to a very exciting, confusing, maybe incoherent, but I think thriving field moving in many, many different directions in many different places. And China is getting a bigger and bigger place in that, I think, because everyone realizes China's impact on the world today.
COVID.
People are looking back at China's impact in the world before now, right? So
this is indeed a very significant development since then. All right, Peter, thank you for your time today.
Well, great. Thanks so much. It's really
Well,
nice talking to you.
Yeah, really nice talking to you.